So the MK party says that the speech that President Cyril Ramaphosa delivered was riddled with empty promises. Ramaphosa delivered the State of the Nation address for the first time under the Government of National Unity, where he outlined strategic priorities for the country. We are now joined by the MK party spokesperson, Nhlamulo Ndhlela. Nhlamulo, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. As the official opposition, yesterday the president announcing that from today on and for the rest of the week, we will see the flags flying at half-mast. And this is to honor the 14 soldiers killed in the DRC. And then on top of that as well, we know about the meeting that will be taking place in Tanzania between SADC as well as the East African community. What should South Africa's posture be in that meeting, considering what the president said also during his State of the Nation address?
I think even before, let me just say good morning to yourself and the viewers. And I think before we can even, touch on some of the comments made by the president, let's firstly highlight to South Africans that we were dressed up in camouflage and regalia in remembrance of the fallen soldiers, because we have realized that this government is not interested in the livelihoods and the well-being of the soldiers. As we know, they've just left them to their own device without any proper, sustainable military support. So that's the first point. Secondly, is that it's disappointing that the South African National Defence Force releases on the day, knowing very well that they were not going to meet up, make their deadline and their commitment to bring back those soldiers. And then at the last moment, send out a statement saying that it's going to be delayed. What does that mean for the families of the fallen soldiers? So we need to hold this government to account. This president is not interested in ensuring that these people are back. And if he were very serious, I mean, these flags would be flying at half-mast already over a week ago, or on the day that the state was informed about this tragic outcome in the DRC. So we're saying this president and his government are not interested in the well-being of South Africans in terms of our security. And this mission is clearly not a peacekeeping mission. Now, what should our posture be in Tanzania? Our posture in Tanzania should be that of exactly what we are as a South African Defence Force. We should be able to, as a country, lead and guide the SADC region in terms of what actually needs to be done here. Because this peacekeeping mission, as long as we seemingly are taking a stance that seems very nonchalant as a country to be reckoned with, we'll never be able to, even if it is a peacekeeping mission, be able to address or even be taken seriously. Right now, because of how we are, in our posture, the SADC region and the world are taking us for a laughingstock.
Yeah. So as the official opposition, and just for clarity, I guess for our viewers as well, we know that the MK party wears military regalia, and when you get sworn in sometimes as well, we see some of your members wearing the military regalia. But considering how seriously you're taking this matter, as the official opposition, what do you believe then should be happening from Parliament's side around holding those people that are involved in the deployment of the SANDF accountable? Or is the posture to say that, listen, this is a SADC mission, there is debates around whether it is a peace mission or offensive mission, there are disagreements around it, but there are those who are saying that there should be accountability for the 14 soldiers who have died.
Look, naturally, there's various avenues within Parliament to take this up. As you would have seen last week, there was, the public debate and a response from the Minister and the Deputy Minister and the Chief of Staff for the Defence. But we are going to take this further because, remember, there's certain questions that they could not answer there. And they were using the platform to, in effect, escape those questions. But we're going to use the Joint Intelligence Committee, where we can, by virtue of us being sworn in and, being vetted, ask very pointed questions in terms of exactly what is happening here. And then, and this naturally happens in the back of, in closed doors, and then we'll be able to get deeper analysis of exactly what's going on here and be able to hold them accountable there. And it's through such platforms and these kind of engagements that we can then hold the President and the Minister of Defense accountable. Unfortunately for South Africans, they would not be able to see that, but we will find a way of demonstrating to South Africans as an official position that we are not going to tolerate a situation where our soldiers are left out there, their own device, to die, and we don't know exactly why they're there, if it actually is a peacekeeping mission in the first place or not. So that's going to be one of the first questions I'm going to ask, because I am going to sit in that, and I'm going to ask a very simple question. Why are we there? What happened? And why don't we even have eye in the sky? Because we have a satellite that is there with the Russians that we've been maintaining. All of a sudden, we don't maintain it. Had we had that eye in the sky, we would have anticipated an attack from, the enemy troops. But no, for selfish reasons, this South African government wants to go and buy a new Turkish satellite. What for? So it's these kind of questions and pointed questions that we're going to need answers for, and they're going to have to answer. There's no ways they can run away from that.
Yeah, and I want to stick on geopolitics before we move over to the domestic stuff. The Trump administration and tensions between South Africa as well as the United States, it seems to be escalating. The MK party had welcomed Trump's inauguration and, amongst others, applauded Trump for his stance to end the unjust and ongoing evil attacks on Palestine. What does the MK party make of Trump's stance now, including, for instance, to take over Gaza, as he has said, and also to argue that there should be sanctions against the International Criminal Court for that indictment against the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the former Defense Force Minister, Gallant?
Well, let's start with the fact that we did send out a statement. Yes, that's correct. And this is because of the back of Trump's comments that he had made with regards to the war in the Ukraine and Russia, where he was the only president of the U.S. that said that the Russian war and Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine war, needs to come to an end. The senseless spending and funding of that war from the U.S. government perspective ought to come to an end. And we applaud him for that. Because we know that, his predecessor in this case was playing a role in funding the Ukraine for that war. So by virtue of him wanting to silence guns there, that we believed was a stance that we wanted him to take, and which was a good one. In the same way, we did say that we welcome the ceasefire in the Gaza-Palestine region and with the Hamas and Israel. Because that's exactly what we stand for. We don't believe in war, and we've always said that countries and other countries need to respect sovereignty. Now, here's another key point. We've said also, the UN Security Council, the issue needs to play much more of a role in these kind of situations. Because if we're going to be living in a peaceful countries, we can't have a situation where leaders are going to be using their veto rights to cop out because they don't want to be politically affiliated with or be showing their hand because the war doesn't seem to be aligned to their allies. No. If you're going to be sitting there and you've got the powers to stop a war, then don't use a veto right to cop out. So the issue of now wanting to take over and play a role and influence other countries' sovereignty, we're saying we don't agree with that. And if there's one thing, indeed, we want people to respect our sovereignty as South Africans. And if there's anyone whatsoever in the form of any president that wants to interfere with our sovereignty, then unfortunately, we're not going to just sit back and accept that. We need to air out our views and say, well, we will not be bullied. And if maybe that's the only thing that Cyril Ramaphosa in this case seemed to have made sense on saying. Those are the only words out of all maybe 100,000 words that he read out yesterday that made sense. We will not be bullied, and we cannot be bullied. It's our sovereignty. We're our own country. And the issue of land, we will deal with it internally.
Yeah. Considering that you have an agreement on that particular part around the country's sovereignty and also the language that was used by the president that we will not be bullied, how then do we move forward, again, with the opposition being led by yourself as the MK party in Parliament, to say, how do we fix these relations with the United States, considering what a critical trade partner the United States is with South Africa, and the impact that that could have on the country's economy, considering that the president, once again, is saying that a 3% GDP growth is what could help us with dealing with unemployment?
Well, the president can't come and tell us about the 3% and use the US situation as a cop-out position. I mean, ever since he's been president, South Africans have been poorer and poorer. Our population grows at 1.3% per year, and yet, our GDP per capita is at a negative growth rate of 0.7%. That alone, that gap tells you that South Africans are growing poorer and poorer, and that there's no beneficiation for us here in this country. So before he can talk about, using other sources of funding and using other avenues to grow the economy, let's deal with our issues internally first, and let's look at what his performance has been. Now, what he's now raising regarding the U.S. Being involved and from that perspective, playing a role. We're saying if we were the government, as the incoming government, we would have dealt with the U.S. relationships and the dynamics differently. And how we're going to deal with that, we'll demonstrate that next week when we do the real State of the Nation address, where we're going to highlight certain shortcomings of this government, and we'll then, present to the South Africans public how we as Mkhonto Wesizwe, one, would have addressed this issue, two, how we can address it going forward. But what we obviously need is for South Africans to give us that opportunity to govern this country. And what we're going to do, we're going to start where Cyril Ramaphosa has fallen very short, where all of a sudden he wants to privatize water and electricity with state-owned entities within the municipalities, where he's going to create water boards and water entities and water and electricity entities and get them funded, in a form of a grant, masqueraded as a grant, but we know it's a loan coming from the IMF and the World Bank. And we are watching this because we know the likes of Sithiwe Koreleni in this case was also forced with this kind of an agreement was shoved down their throat, where they have to now also privatize, water and electricity in the form of these entities. So we are watching, but we're saying, as Mkhonto Wesizwe, we would have obviously taken a totally different approach, but we will give highlights of exactly how we, as the incoming government, will run this country and how we will deal with these kind of issues, whether it be international relations or domestic issues.
Yeah. On that water problem, because the problem is there already, and we know with Operation Vulindlela, the president has also spoken about bringing in the private partnerships to try and invest in all of the bulk infrastructure that the country requires. If the plan does go ahead, how then do you ensure that the tariffs that you and I pay for that water doesn't shoot up? Because we know on the one end that business is driven by profit.
You're spot on. And this is the one thing that we've always said. And he referred to the network industries, as you recall yesterday, where he talks about the network industries and how he's going to bring in... No. And that's the biggest problem. During President Zuma's the cost of electricity, you would get 80 kilowatts for 100 rand. Today, for 100 rand, you get 25 kilowatts. You know what compounds that? What compounds that are the interest in the loans driven by the policies, the punitive policies that we are continuously drowning ourselves with, and him specifically has continuously indebted the country with when it comes to IMF loans and when it comes to World Bank loans. So this is exactly what we're faced with. How do you can't get out of what he has actually gotten the country into, and then expect that the network industries in the form of services, whether it be water and electricity, will be cheaper and be more efficient in terms of the service delivery from a service delivery perspective. What he's now doing, like I mentioned earlier, he is now wanting to privatize municipal infrastructure. And that's what they do. They run these state-owned entities and state apparatus infrastructure down to the ground, and then want to resurrect it with private sector funding or so-called public-private partnerships. And that we know has been their case through. Look at what has happened with SAA. SAA was, in actual fact, we know, totally, killed at some point where it didn't exist. And what did they do? They were doing that only to create a market for FlySafair. Look at how FlySafair is booming today. And if you look at some of the shareholders behind FlySafair, you'll know exactly what was happening, and they're linked to certain ministers who presided over SAA. So, this is their modus operandi. They want to privatize the country and make it their own company. And we can't allow that. It's no longer about the people. And that's why they find themselves in a coalition with the DA, and you know what Helen Zille said. It was business that said to Helen Zille, protect Cyril Ramaphosa and position yourself and this coalition as a GNU, and it will work, and he'll be able to sell it internally. And that's what he has done. He sold it to leaders who have got no vision whatsoever within the ANC, and they accepted a DA-led coalition. Today, he reads out a state as a failed state of the so-called nothing address, quite honestly, that has marginalized 25% of the electorate. So how is it possible that this president is there to represent the people and actually is interested in transforming and growing this country? Okay. Nada, zilch.
Part of your work also as the official opposition is ensuring that the executive is held accountable. 10 political parties are part of the government of national unity. You formed the Progressive Caucus. There have been some skirmishes outside of Parliament between yourself as well as the EFF. What's the future of the Progressive Caucus and also your working relationship with the EFF in ensuring that the executive is held accountable, that these promises that have been made are actually kept?
Well, here's the reality. The EFF is a party on its own, and so is MK being a party on its own. We work closely with the EFF. There's many of us within MK that have got very good relationships with the leadership. I'm sure you'd have seen yesterday. We're very cordial and comradely. So, you know, there's this perception that's also being driven by certain elements of the media is quite honestly one that's unfortunate. But we understand that this is politics. We understand the dynamics of these politics that we're in, and we need to take into consideration that, yes, we've got a bigger agenda here. In as much as we have differences in certain areas, we agree in many other areas. And that's why, have you ever heard us mention that the Progressive Caucus no longer exists? No, the Progressive Caucus is still there. We're still working with them in Parliament, and we'll continue to work with the EFF and all the other partners, the UAT, the Coloured Congress, and the ATM. As a Progressive Caucus. And until then, take it as it is, that the Progressive Caucus is still alive. We're still working closely with all the other parties to achieve what we want to achieve. Remember, this is not just a selfish party-led agenda. This is a broader program for our people and to liberate our people.